Hello, and welcome to Minor VCR Repair Volume 2. This film is a follow-up to our first two films, Professional VCR Cleaning and A Layman's Guide to Minor VCR Repair. If you have not yet viewed these two films, we would suggest that you do so before continuing, as they will demonstrate some important procedures, including cover removal. In this presentation, we'll probe a little deeper into some common VCR problems and show you how to solve them. As in the other films, only simple common tools will be needed. Today we're going to look at tape-in sensors, reel table sensors, replacement of an RF modulator, and the replacement of a cassette loading motor. Once again, this film is not designed to be a replacement for manufacturer's procedures. Always contact the manufacturer if you are ever in doubt about any procedure. Let's go ahead and have a look at the tools we'll need. The common items that you see displayed here are available through Electronix Incorporated or your local distributor. First, some desoldering braid. Next, some 60/40 mixture solder. A VHS view-through tool. This can come in very handy for testing proper operation of the reels and the idler. A solder sucker. A common Phillips tip screwdriver, an electric soldering iron, some locking hemostats, some diagonal cutters or nippy cutters, and a set of helping hands can be useful. The first problem we're going to look at is the replacement of a tape-in sensor. Some common symptoms of a bad sensor are: number one, the tape-in indicator will be lit when there is not a tape in the VCR, and it will not accept a tape. Number two, while in the play mode, the VCR will stop and go into rewind for no apparent reason. Number three, it may eject a tape without touching the eject button. This tape-in sensor problem is most common on RCA and Hitachi brand VCRs. Okay, we've gone ahead and removed the top cover. Next, we're going to need to remove the faceplate. There's 3 screws that hold it on top. 1, 2, and 3. There's also 3 that'll need to be removed on the bottom. They're right up front. Here's 1, there's 2, and third one. Go ahead and take the bottom ones out first. And don't forget before you start to make sure that the VCR is unplugged. Okay, now we'll want to flip it back over and remove these 3 screws. Okay, now we want to very gently lift up on the plastic tabs that those screws were set into. Be very careful not to break the tabs. They're very, very delicate. And when you have them up, pull the faceplate straight out and it comes right off. Next, we're going to take out the cassette housing. First, remove this metal bar on top. Come straight up. This particular VCR is an RCA VLT series. It has 2 screws that hold the cassette housing in and the electrical connector that we just took off. 1 screw is located here. And the other's on the opposite side. Okay, once you have those out, lift the housing straight up. Our sensors are now exposed. Here's one sensor circuit board on the left side of the housing, and there's another sensor behind the loading motor on the right side. It's located here. We now have the cassette housing removed and it is away from the VCR. We're first going to work with the left sensor. The sensor is mounted behind this printed circuit board here. To remove it, grasp it firmly and pull it straight out. There's no screws to retain it. Your view has now been magnified 6 times and you're looking at the opposite side of the small circuit board we just removed. This is the sensor. It has 2 small legs. Looking at the top of the sensor, you'll notice a yellow color. Yellow generally means that this sensor is bad or will go bad at some point in time. Next, you'll need a hot soldering iron. Here are the 2 points we're going to desolder. And finish up with point number 2. This is the sensor itself removed from the circuit board. It's time to remount a new sensor. Located very close to the bottom of the sensor, you'll see 2 small notches. The sensor needs to be bent at a 90-degree angle at these 2 notches. After you've done that, reinsert the sensor the same way it came out. Before soldering, make sure it lines up on the white block underneath the sensor. It's now time to resolder the sensor back in. The 2 points are very close, so be careful not to get a solder bridge across. Don't forget to trim the leads. You'll notice the top of this sensor is green. It's now time to replace the right sensor. First, make sure the left sensor is free. Next, there are 2 small screws that need to be removed. While removing and replacing these screws, take care not to damage or turn the gears. Turning the housing around, we'll notice a small circuit board. This is a sensor. It's mounted on the opposite side. Desolder these 2 points. There are 2 small black clips on the top. Squeeze these in as you remove the sensor, which is located down here. Use your hemostats. And there's the sensor. This sensor is identical to the other sensor with the exception of being mounted in that housing. Okay, we now have a new sensor. You'll notice the legs need to be clipped. Clip them approximately 1/4 inch above the base. Remount the sensor and reinstall the screws. When reinstalling the motor and circuit board, it is important to note one thing. You'll notice these 2 white plunger-looking objects, one here and one here. You'll also see 2 black ones, which are located here. After you reinsert the circuit board, which you'll see here, make sure it fits in firmly and that these plungers line up with each other. This is essential. Also, make sure you can see the sensor from the other side. After you have completely rechecked the cassette housing for proper reassembly, it's time to replace it. Notice the two tabs pointed out here, 1 and 2. These two must be securely seated before replacing the two screws. Failure to do this procedure will result in improper operation of the VCR. After the two screws are in, replace the electrical connector. Next, replace the metal brace. And follow that up with the faceplate. Once again, be very careful not to crack or break the tabs on the faceplate. Then replace the top 3 screws, and don't forget the 3 on the bottom. We're now going to replace the supply and take-up sensors on a Multitech or Dynatech type unit, which we'll find to be a little bit different than the previous one. We've gone ahead and removed the top cover and the faceplate. Next, remove the cross brace. Once again, the cassette housing must be removed. This particular one is held into place by 4 screws, 2 each on both sides, all the way in the front. You've heard it before, but we can't say it enough. Make sure the VCR is always unplugged before you remove the cover. This particular model has 2 electrical connectors, one on the right and a small one on the left. With a little bit of work, the cassette housing will now come free. Our view is now magnified 12 times. This is the sensor on the left. You'll notice it's mounted to a very, very tiny printed circuit board. On the rear of the circuit board is one very small screw. Remove that screw. And pull the sensor out. As with the previous sensors, it's held into place by 2 solder joints. Desolder it and replace it. We're now going to replace the right sensor, which will be considerably more complicated. Watch closely. First, you'll notice 2 screws on the top of the printed circuit board. Remove these 2 screws. Next, you'll find one small screw below the cassette loading motor, which is located here. Remove that screw. The cassette loading motor will now move freely. Two more screws need removed at this time. First, remove the cassette loading belt. First, remove the top screw. Once it's removed, a small bracket on the top will come free. Which is here. Next, remove the screw on the bottom. As you can see, the sensor is well protected by the loading assembly. Now pull the motor free from the bracket. We can finally see the sensor. We now have a close-up view of the sensor. It's held into place by one small screw. Loosen the screw. Using your locking hemostats, pull it free. We can now see the sensor circuit board. It also has a small screw. Remove this. Next, pull the housing off. And once again, we can see our sensor. Desolder the 2 points. And don't forget, take note which direction the sensor faces. We're now going to take a look at the replacement of a reel table sensor. The unit we're going to perform this on is a common Gold Star player. The cover is removed and we now have an overhead top view. First, the cassette housing must be removed. This particular model has 6 screws that hold it into place, and 1 electrical connector. While we're removing these, let me tell you about the 2 major symptoms of a bad reel sensor. First, when put into play mode, the VCR or VCP will play for about 5 seconds and then go into stop mode for no apparent reason. Number 2, if the VCR has a digital counter, the counter readings will be irregular. For example, it may start at 0 and jump to 5, then jump to 15, then to 50, without stopping in between. Once the screws are out, remove the faceplate and the cassette housing. The small circuit board that's being pointed out is the reel table sensor circuit board. To get to it, you must first remove the take-up reel and the white brake. The take-up reel is held on by a common E-clip. After that's removed, pull the reel straight up and out. Next, the white brake must be removed. It's also held on by an E-clip. Once the clip is off, pull the brake straight up and lay it to the side. We can now get to the circuit board. One screw holds it in place. Go ahead and remove the electrical connector. We now have a close-up view of the reel table sensor circuit board. This is the sensor. Notice it's encased in a black housing. Here is the electrical connector. The procedure is now quite simple. There are 4 solder points that need to be desoldered. To save time, we've previously desoldered these. After you do, squeeze the 2 black clips and the sensor will easily come out. The sensor itself will slide easily out of the black housing. One important thing to note is the sensor has one flat side. When reinserting your new sensor into the housing, make sure the flat sides align. Failure to do so will result in improper operation of the sensor. Once you have done that, simply reinsert it back into the printed circuit board, making sure all 4 legs come through the other side. Make sure the black clips lock into place. We're now going to replace the sensor circuit board and the cassette housing assembly. First, install the electrical connector on the circuit board. Next, reinstall the screw that holds the circuit board into place. Third, remount the brake. You'll notice the small mirror window-like objects underneath the take-up reel. These work with the sensor. Check for free play on the take-up reel and the idler. We can now reinstall the cassette housing assembly. Don't forget the electrical connector. After the housing is mounted, it's an opportune time to use your view-through tool to test for proper reel function and idler. Remount the faceplate. You'll notice the faceplate must be installed before the front two screws can be reinserted. After you're through with that, recheck your work and replace the cover. Let's have a look at the replacement of an RF modulator. The RF modulator takes the composite or raw video and audio signals and modulates them up to channel 3 or 4 for viewing on a television set. These connectors should look familiar. They're the ones on the back of the VCR. Cable in and the out to TV jack. RF modulators can be damaged in several ways. The two most common are an electrical or power spike that comes through the cable line. Number 2, a VCR which falls and the cable jerks the connector out of the housing. Let's now go ahead and have a look at the replacement of a typical RF modulator. We'll use a Fisher. Looking at the rear, you can see now where the RF modulator is. We've removed the cover screws, and now let's take the top off. We're now looking at a view from the front of the VCR. There's a circuit board in the rear that must be moved to the side. It's held into place by 4 screws. Go ahead and remove these. The symptom of a bad RF modulator is the loss of video and audio. Mechanically, the VCR seems to operate normally. Now, slide the circuit board towards the front. Be careful not to pull too hard on the wires. Now remove these 2 screws. We now have an overhead view of the modulator. Remove this connector. Next, bend back and pull the module straight out. After that, remove the electrical connector on the lower part. This modulator is held into place by 3 screws. There's a simple way to test for a bad RF modulator. If you have a monitor TV that has video and audio inputs, connect the video and audio out on the VCR to the video and audio in on the monitor TV. If you have a picture and sound, then 9 times out of 10 the RF modulator is bad. And it's simple as that. Go ahead and remount a new RF modulator. taking note of the position of the screw holes. Next, replace the electrical connector, taking note of its polarity. Replace the connector on the top of the RF modulator. Reinsert the assembly back into the VCR. And replace the two screws that held it into place. Go ahead and remount the circuit board. Be careful not to pinch any wires as you remount it. We're now going to have a look at how to replace a cassette loading motor, which you will find on front-loading VCRs. The one we're going to look at is the Magnavox, Panasonic, General Electric, or Sylvania line of VCRs. The obvious symptom here is that the VCR will not accept a tape. Okay, we've now removed the top cover and the front faceplate. Next, we need to remove the cassette housing. There's a total of 4 screws that hold it in. And 4. And also the electrical connector. Don't forget, as a safety precaution, always make sure your VCR is unplugged. And there's screw number 4. The housing will now simply lift straight out. Here on the side we'll find the loading motor and the loading gears. Take care not to turn the loading gears if you don't have to. Okay, once again we have a side view of the cassette housing. Briefly, how it works is the motor, which is located here, will drive the shaft in the front. The shaft in turn will drive the gear assembly below it. When that happens, a cassette is inserted into the front, it slides in and down. We're now going to go ahead and remove the motor. You'll see 1 screw here and 1 screw here. Go ahead and remove these 2. And this one. Take care when you're removing the screws not to bend or break the wires that surround it. Now, in the front of the motor there are 2 black plastic arms which protrude out. One's here and the other right below. Gently insert a small screwdriver and apply pressure from the front, wedging it out. There are 2 small black plastic tabs that must be moved. And now the motor is removed. When you remove it, be sure to look on the rear and see the 2 wires that connect to it. They're generally red and blue. Take note which color wire goes to which terminal when you replace it with the new motor. Make sure you line your gears back up. Reinsert the motor as you took it out. Remount the cassette housing, your front faceplate, and the top cover. That's going to end this session of Minor Repair Part 2. Thank you for joining us.